Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. My subject today, by the leave of the ground, the engineers at 3rd Ypres. Where do I begin explaining that? Well, I think I'll just flick the next slide, because it tells us what we mean by the leave of the ground. You've all heard of Rudyard Kipling, and he did a poem called The Sappers. Now the line's but a man with a gun in his hand, and cavalry's only what horses can stand, and artillery moves by the leave of the ground. But we are the men that do something all round, for we are Her Majesty's Royal Engineers, with the rank and pay of a sapper. Key phrase there is, the artillery moves by the leave of the ground. What does that mean? Well, it means that terrain conditions have to be tolerable in order to move artillery. It's a very simple thing. And artillery became a central fact of the First World War. It is an artillery-based war. It's responsible for some of the most iconic images of the war, the guns. It's certainly responsible for much of the damage and destruction that was done on the Western Front that gives its particular character. However, the road that the BEF took from its pre-war Edwardian ethos to an acceptance of the primary, of the industrial, of the process, of bureaucracy, of administration, and of logistics and engineering, was something of a rocky one. And that will be the subject of my talk tonight. In a sense, I'm talking about, in a narrow sense, the development of operations and, if you like, the impact of the civil upon the military. Now, in this sense, the civil did not so much negotiate with the military, in my opinion, as mount a complete takeover. They got hold of operations in their fundamental sense, in terms of what underpins them, their most, how can I put this, their most fundamental nature, and they changed it. The extent to which the BEF, the military, understood this and inculcated this, internalised it, and then expressed it on the battlefield, shaped the course of the First World War. So, without ado, I'm going to move on. The premises I've got are quite simple. The Great War was fought at the tactical and operational level, and from this central reality, all else derives. No matter what field you're in, studying with the First World War, gender studies, economic studies, experiential, cultural studies, this is a central fact. It was a strange war because the way it was organised, the way it was set up, the continuous trenches that ran from the North Sea right the way down to Switzerland, meant that traditional military strategy simply could not be used here. It could not outflank the enemy because there was no flank to outflank. This meant that it would be frontal assaults which would gain any results. And frontal assaults against a powerful defensive system became extremely costly. As the conflict developed, so of course artillery became the way of battering through these frontal defences. But more importantly, it meant it was a war that was fought at the operational and tactical level. It's about organising your weapons of war, your troops and your other resources against the enemy. That the nature of warfare changed fundamentally during the Great War at the operation and tactical level. The war that was fought in 1917, perhaps the most important year of the war, would have been incomprehensible to the average infantry officer, cavalry officer or Army Service Corps officer in 1914, just before the start of the First World War, the start of the war itself. It was entirely different. If you like, the last hurrah of the traditional Edwardian army occurred sometime just before November of 1914, whereupon the entire front began to coalesce into something different. I'm going to argue that it ceased to be primarily a martial event, becoming instead a civilian or at least a civil affair. Now that sounds almost ridiculous. It's warfare, it's soldiers, of course it's martial. Well, it rather depends what we mean by martial in this respect. Next point, despite its pre-war culture and ethos, the BEF responded to the changed conditions but failed to fully understand the logistical and engineering imperatives that arose from this change. They were not a bunch of donkey-headed generals sat somewhere in the past, muttering to themselves that they found the internal combustion engine unnatural in some kind of way, preferring instead horseflesh. They grasped the First World War, and indeed one might argue that Haig, who's usually seen as the ultimate symbol of the cavalryman general, was actually something of a techno-gadget freak. This incomplete understanding led to operational failure in 1917 that had profound consequences. In 1916, arguably the Allies had found a way of making war. They got much better at it. They had built up their resources, their productivity, they were doing training, and they had found an operational method. Their strategy, because of the nature of the war, was one of attrition. The notion of breaking through, and what was called the G in the gap, that means the GG, or the horse, can break through the lines, it will send the cavalry in to disrupt everything around it, was over. And indeed, the fighting itself defined the nature of the front and the extent to which the front would continue on into 1918. Through an analysis of the development of BF operational methodology, through a case study of 3rd Ypres, I think that this reveals these main issues. The software of the mind, military culture and ethos. Now, I must admit, this is trepidatious territory for me. I'm a military historian. I'm an operational historian. I know things about Vickers machine guns. I know how to build trenches. I know about tactical moves and platoons. Culture and ethos belong to that other side. War and society, or the new military history as it's being called nowadays, though, since it was called the new military history in the 60s, and then it was defined again in the 90s as the new military history. I suppose we're on to the 3rd incarnation, which was the new military history. Generally speaking, the war and society, or new military historians, or triple new military historians, do not like traditional military historians at all. We're dodgy. We're a little bit right-wing, must be, you know, establishment, you know, and we play around with soldiers and things like that. We're narrative. We're not proper academics. Indeed, I have been called at my old institution, I won't say by whom, a paintballer and a hobbyist. Such is however, despite the fact that I, as a military historian, tend to look askance at war and society, the reality is that if we can bring these two disciplines together, we will get a much greater understanding of the depth and breadth of the war and what it actually meant, which is ultimately what history is all about. So I've dipped my toe into the world of culture to understand how the war was actually fought on the Western Front, how it should have been fought, or why it was fought the way it was. Now, J.A. Lynn, writing in a seminal piece of work, a journal article, The Embattled Future of Military History in 1997, as a traditional military historian, begins his article off with, takes quite a hostile approach to the new military historians. But later on this develops, and he makes some very, very important points about battle itself. And I'll just read a few quotes from there that I just picked up, which really sum this up. Military reality is also culturally dependent as well. Battle styles are not simply pragmatic products of technology, but cultural choices. Culture is in dialogue with technological and social reality. Battle is ultimately a cultural construction, and he's absolutely right. The problem with military historians is they tend to study battle as though isolated from culture and society. They're quite willing to accept the if you like, the changing nature of the soldier because of the influx of so many working class men into the ranks themselves. They're quite happy to accept technology itself. However, they don't look and exclude the role of culture in creating operations and battle. What is culture and ethos? Well, some definitions. You turn to the OED at moments like this. The ideas, customs, social behaviour of a particular people or society. Typical OED definition doesn't tell us anything. So, Geert Hofstede, who is one of the doyens, shall we say, of cultural studies, defined it as the software of the mind. And I think that's an excellent description, the software of the mind. It informs our everyday perceptions. It informs our everyday understanding. It informs our reactions. T. Deal and A. Kennedy, also cultural historians, they describe it as the way things are done round here. Now, the pragmatist in me quite likes that. That's a good definition. So a combination of the software of the mind and the way things are done round here. Ethos, well, the OEDs actually come through here. The characteristic spirit of a culture, era or community as manifested in its attitudes and aspirations. So the attitudes and aspirations of a British public, of an industrial British public, who function within the paradigm of process, of repetition, of regimentation, and of the idea of material, will bring and manifest those attitudes on the battlefield itself. Right, the Edwardian army. culture and ethos. But the Edwardian army, like most armies, believed that human qualities were paramount. It's the triumph of the human will. Such functions as character, bravery, self-control, if you like, the internal moral spirit, the moral fibre, were what won wars and made a good soldier. They were certainly aware of modern technology and the firepower implications of that, but they saw these as tools for commanders to use rather than an entirely new way of making war. So they saw them in isolation. They saw how they could be applied to battle. They were not blind to modern technology and its use on the battlefield, but they failed to fully grasp the implications of it. Battle itself was really driven by the cult of the offensive, both with the British Army and also in the French Army as well. La guerre outrance, if you like. It dominated. Wars were therefore won, battle was won, by morally superior, better trained force attacking and defeating the enemy. Notice the word attack. And General Ian Hamilton, who later went on to conduct the ill-fated Dardanelles expedition, presented himself as every inch the reactive Edwardian soldier in 1910. War is essentially the triumph not of the machine gun over a rifle, not of a line of men entrenched behind wire entanglements and fire-swept zones over men exposing themselves in the open, but of one will over another, weaker will. So for the Edwardian army, battle was about will. It was about moral superiority. What it was not about was machine guns or barbed wire. Now this, looking at it some years later, seems an almost ridiculous position to take. It's like the last hurrah of the Edwardian army. We have to remember that General Ian Hamilton himself was an observer during the Russo-Japanese War, arguably the first war to really develop and demonstrate the power of trenches, barbed wire, machine guns and artillery. And as an observer, it had quite a profound effect on him, because he, along with others, saw this as the potential future of warfare. And he was particularly affected by one episode, which was the Battle of Terayama, which was conducted by the Japanese Osaka Brigade against the Russians. Now the Russians were dug in excellent positions, overlooking a plain. They had trenches, they had barbed wire, they had machine guns, they had modern repeating rifles, and they had artillery. They had all the elements, effectively, you will find in the First World War. Now the defensive, by this point, had become extraordinarily powerful. Traditionally, it's the attack which will carry the day. The defence is always weaker than the attack. However, we're now at a hiatus point, a cusp, where the defence is becoming more powerful than the attack. And he saw a traditional assault by the Osaka Brigade, men moving under fire, using cover and rush procedures. These are tactics that have been taught since time immemorial. And it appeared they were wiped out in the face of all this firepower. However, as the dust began to settle, he saw that they were still moving across the plain, and they were still moving as a coherent unit. And eventually, despite high casualties, they took the position. And from this, he concluded that it was still the moral will, the man with a bayonet, a bit of cold steel, which will carry the day against any amount of technology. And indeed, that was one of the reasons why we were so ill prepared for the war that came in 1914. Let's have a look at warriors in battle, because the ultimate expression, if you like, of the moral soldier, of the soldier with will, is the warrior. Battle is framed in terms of an encounter between opposing forces. It's a match between two combatants. It's not an industrial process. In fact, in the war, the two combatants were probably about 3,000 or 4,000 yards apart and never see each other. But this, today, is how we still see battle. And battles, in this sense, are fought by warriors. And warriors means one who is engaged in or experienced in battle, one who is engaged aggressively or energetically in activity, cause or conflict. So the notion of the warrior is linked with battle. And the notion of the warrior is also linked with that of the will. This is where I come to the word martial now, and why I claim this was not a particularly martial war. Characteristic of or befitting a warrior. The question I ask myself is, to what extent was the warrior applicable in an industrialized war such as the First World War? However, it's also a powerful, attractive, romantic and enduring ethos. Nobody ever joined the army, no young man ever joined the army to go and be a ledger storekeeper. And if you decide to join, even today, the Royal Logistics Corps or any of the specialist technical arms, you can wave bye-bye to any chance of becoming Chief of Staff. They're kind of still looked down upon. And to give you some idea of just how powerful this particular attractive, romantic and enduring this ethos is, I turn now to America in 2012. The US Warrior Ethos. This infuses the US Army. It's part of the Warrior Program, a deliberate attempt to inculcate the concepts, the culture of the warrior into US soldiers. The warrior ethos is grounded in a refusal to accept failure. It is developed and sustained through discipline, commitment to the army, values and pride in the army's heritage. There's nothing in there about M1A1 tanks or the amount of firepower required to take out a particular place. This is again all about the will. It's a moral definition. What are those US Army values? Well, there's 7 of them. They're listed out. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honour, integrity and personal courage. Now all of these are human-centred values, very much redolent of the dominance of the moral in 19th century military culture. Moral character, moral fibre, this triumph of the human will. This is indeed, this programme has caused much consternation and debate in the Canadian military, who consider themselves far less gung-ho and really question deeply the role and place of the concept of the warrior in a modern military armed force. And since they are right next door and tend to be dragged along in the wake of US military decisions and ideas, they are concerned that this particular idea will begin to infiltrate the Canadian military. Now this will become of some importance later on, because I'll be contrasting the Canadians with the British when we look at operations. Let's turn now, after looking at the human will, the character and nature of the Edwardian army, and how they conceived of battle, to the mass production battlefield, which is indeed what the battlefield on the First World War becomes. And I'm going to have a look at the nature of this battlefield and the response to this machine age battlefield on the Western Front. It was described by JFC Fuller as a war between the Midlands and the Ruhr. Turning now to the times in which we live, the World War showed us how immense the supply problem is. In fact, it may be called a war between 2 great supply systems, a war between the Midlands and the Ruhr. You can almost take that further by saying 2 gigantic cities, these huge metropoli were created, where men lived and worked. Ferdinand Baruch, writing just before the war, after the war, modern war is a death grapple between peoples and economic systems rather than a conflict of armies alone. Now we contrast these definitions of the First World War with this martial view of the First World War contained in the notion of the human will. And the shop floor upon which they worked, something like that. Colonel G.C. Shaw, writing in 1938 on a book called Supply and Battle, made this observation: an army is a factory for standard and a storehouse for standardized products. It is a mass production machine. This is as far away as you can possibly get from this Edwardian concept of war, and indeed one that's come around again. And here on this particular photograph we have, if you like, the most typical scene from the war. The most typical scene from a war is not some soldier stumbling through some hellish battlefield with craters up to his waist in mud. If you like, the icon of the war, the ultimate leitmotif of the war is contained in this photograph, because this is what the war was all about. It was about supply and machines. Have a look at the war machine. Warfare, certainly by 1917, had become an interconnected industrial process. It relied upon science, technology, and the practices of industry. Organisation, distribution, and application of material products of industry in the most efficient and effective manner. And like any other industrial process, effectively, but with very, very serious health and safety issues. If we look at those words, science, technology and practice of industry, it's useful to look at very briefly at the artillery. In 1914, the British went to war with small field guns, very lightweight, very modern 18-pounder guns, designed for a mobile war, which is the war that they envisaged. The gunner, the ideal gunner, if you like, the super gunner, was the man who stuck to his guns. He would give infantry support using this particular weapon. The infantry would be in sight. They would be advancing towards him. He'd engage at anywhere between about 800 right down to about 200 yards. Using his nerve, his moral superiority, he would fire over open sight. So he would actually aim the gun itself at this target, the enemy advancing. And having loosed off some rounds, he would then hitch up his gun and his limber and zoom off to the next position. It's dashing. It's very much in the mould of this warrior ethos, if we like. By 1917, the ideal gunner was a scientist, a mathematician, because scientific gunnery had now taken over. The enemy had created, and the Allies had created an empty battlefield, an area so lethal that to stay on the surface was to invite death. Now the enemy were hidden, and the enemy's guns were hidden away. The British Army had no idea initially of how to locate the enemy. If you can't see him, how can you fire at him? How do you know where he is? And so through a process of the application of technology and science, they came up with a system whereby a British gun could engage with the enemy, say an enemy gun, at a distance of 5,000 or 6,000 yards against a hidden position over the other side of the hill, known as OTH, or over the horizon. And they would do so using mathematics, ballistics. Effectively, what would happen is that the gun itself would be calibrated to understand its error. The shells would be batched into groups so that they were consistent in flight. Meteograms would be got from GHQ to give us atmospheric conditions, different pressure through which the shell would fly, and therefore this was all dialed in, all this information was dialed into a thing called an artillery board. An artillery board is basically a set of data. That's all it is, just columns of data. And the columns of data are on the right hand side with all the corrections put in for what you dialed into your gun. And having dialed that into your gun, you then fired your gun. This is the work of a technician. Yeah? This is operatives. These are operating guns. They're not firing them anymore. This is a world away within just 3 years from the original conception of the gunner. So we can see just how dramatically technology, systems, if you like, the concepts that underpin society and drove it forward in an industrial society changed entirely the nature of not just the gunner, but the whole act of firing a gun. On top of that, the gunner in 1914 would be expected to act as an individual. He would be nominally part of a battery, but their gun would be, if you like, its own world, where they would dash in with their weapon as a warrior and deal the business out. In 1917, there was no such thing as an individual gun, nor even an individual battery. They were brought together, organised, standardised. It was the weight of firepower, the interrelationship between the guns themselves that provided, if you like, the damage to the enemy and hopefully a breakthrough. So we can see there how the war machine has come about, and it is literally a machine. Everything's integrated, everything has its part. One of the themes we find in World War I literature, especially amongst the memoirs of those who have been there, is the notion of the soldier is a cog in a machine. Well, your instincts serve you right, because as a soldier you are a cog in a giant machine, an integrated machine designed to do a particular task. Note the word task. It becomes task-centered, the war. It's not about this glorious division or that brigade. It's about getting on with a task. And the guns, the various weapons of war are organised according to task. We see a big change, if you like, in the way that operations are conducted. Instead of each division having its own guns, it looks neither left nor right to what anybody else needs, it's now conducted at a higher level according to task. So the task has now become the centre, if you like, of operational development. And task is very much a civil concept. It's about doing a job. Indeed, again, if we look to the soldiers' memoirs, we find a change, which is like the soldiers of 1917 or 1918 were very different from the volunteers beforehand. They had no illusions about what was coming. They had seen the casualty list. Enough information had leaked back to Britain for them to know that it's a pretty rough place. And they are there to do a job. The phrase appears over and over again, to do a job. Now a job, again, this is not, if you like, an assault on a tactical point, it becomes a job. Very much a civil or civilian concept. Now, how do we reprogram this software? How does the BEF, especially at the higher echelons, respond to this? Well, there was debate in the pre-war era. It wasn't just a case, I don't want to give the impression that the Edwardian army was full of moral characters who had no interest in anything else other than the moral will applied in battle. And indeed amongst, for example, the Navy, Royal Navy, as David Edgerton in Liberal Militarism wrote, the historical school favoured a return to Nelsonian principles of heroic command, rejecting the material school that stressed organisation, technology and a greater role for the engineer officers. So within the Navy, and also within the Army as well, there was like tension. There was something, not a battle royal taking place, but certainly a repositioning, an argument being put forward by the various schools. If you like, one school being the technological firepower school, the other school being the idea of heroic command, with all its implications for the will and the moral. Now, Tim Travers wrote in The Killing Ground, I'm not usually a great fan of Tim Travers, but when somebody says something that I think is right, I'll accept it. The proponents of the human battlefield paradigm were starting mentally to engage the technological paradigm, although fundamental conceptions of war were naturally hard to change. We have to remember this all happens extraordinarily rapidly. So it must not be forgotten just how far and how fast mental changes had to travel from the previous decade. I'm going to ask the question here, try and illustrate the problem. What is a machine gun? It seems a self-evident thing. It's a gun. It fires automatically, lots of rounds. Okay, but the big question is it a gun or is it a machine? Because the difference between the two is quite fundamental. Now, in 1915, the BEF began to form brigade machine gun companies. Before that, each battalion, about 900 to 1,000 men, had 2 machine guns, and they went forward with the battalion. Battalions are effectively expendable pawns, looking at it somewhat callously, and those machine guns were there to provide direct supporting fire for the infantry. You aimed these guns at people and you shot them. They were effectively something like a super rifle. Right, in 1915 it began to realise that they were frittering away these assets by leaving them with battalions who was like, you might have a 12 battalion attack, each battalion using its machine guns very, very differently. And therefore there was no coherence. So they began to brigade them, which meant they formed companies. So they took the machine guns off the battalions and they formed companies at the brigade level. Now, this was a recognition of the utility of machine guns and also the increasing operational scope and scale in a quite small way. It's recognising shifting from a machine which they were somewhat uncomfortable with, which they felt was something that challenged the human will, to something they began to realise was quite vital on the battlefield. I think a few massacres by German machine gunners during the 1914 campaigns focused their mind on this. Now, the brigades themselves had to choose personnel for this. What criteria do you use? Well, 2 criteria emerged. First criteria was marksmanship. Do you choose according to marksmanship? And indeed, many brigades did. Now, by using the term marksmanship as your dominant factor here, it becomes a martial gauge of competence. It's derived from the warrior belief in the primacy of skill at arms. That you are good with your weapon, that you can handle it, and that you can aim it. It is about skill at arms. That's where marksmanship comes from. Or is it about mechanical familiarity? Is it a machine? This is a civil gauge of competence. It's derived from the belief in efficiency and effectiveness of mechanical systems operated by specialists. If you like, at this point, the machine gun becomes no different from any machine you might find on a factory floor, which requires specialist operatives to make it run. Now, in the 10th Brigade, they opted for a machine criteria. In fact, to quote Hugh Ellis, Brigadier General CPA Hull, the men, so far as possible, have followed engineering trades in civil life. So we have here an example of a commander who understands this as a machine rather than as a marksman. The question is, was he right to do so? Well, by 1917, machine guns were integrated into batteries, that is 6 machine guns, and used for interlocking indirect fire. That means they cannot see their targets whatsoever, they're firing right over the hill, against unseen targets and areas. This required a good grasp of mathematics, ballistics and mechanical engineering. What it did not require was any marksmanship skills. So here we see, once again, if you like, the dominance of the machine and the ethos and culture from which it springs. Furthermore, I'm going to quote Brigadier General CPA Hull, Captain L.G. Pilkington. My brigade machine gun officer has been of great assistance to me, not only in the manner he has supervised the work of the machine gun sections and in training fresh details, but also in mapping and schemes for the improvement of drainage and trenches and supply of water to huts and billets, because this is now what the war is becoming about. He is a civil engineer in private life and so has special knowledge of these matters. He is worthy of mention in dispatches. So Pilkington begins to represent the new hero, a civil engineer. Couldn't have asked for better, really. A man who understands the nature of this war, can move beyond his mere task of being a brigade machine gun officer to something beyond that. He understands this war. This war is familiar to him. It is a war, even in 1915, of drainage and supply. These are almost municipal in their context. The glamour and intensity were gone. The thing about the idea of a warrior and the idea of battle as a clash of arms and skill of arms is it's very, very attractive. I've been to an awful lot of military installations. I've been to an awful lot of military messes, especially Sandhurst, the premier mess in the United Kingdom, officer mess in the United Kingdom. And if you walk down the corridors, you will see very large paintings. And on those very large paintings, you will see the Battle of Salamanca, the Battle of this, the Battle of that. And inevitably, there will be heroic. They will be men fighting against the odds. There will be horses rearing up. And even when we look at something like the Battle of El Alamein, it'll be the Iron Horse majestically cresting a hill as it crushes into the enemy. Of course, warfare, certainly from 1915 onwards, was absolutely nothing like that. And R.H. Mottram, probably the best observer of the war, in the Spanish Farm trilogy, wrote that the glamour intensity were gone from the war and the situation was now one for municipal health officers. And he's right, because it is. Operational warfare in the Great War now constituted the efficient organisation, administration and application of products and processes of an advanced mass industrial society utilised in battle in order to achieve the highest level of task effectiveness. You could probably read that in any commercial enterprise today. Profoundly civilian. And even if you look at the soldier of 1917, John Bourne described him as the working man in arms and made the point that he wears a safety helmet, just as you would down a mine. He wears a technological thing called the gas mask and goggles. He looks like a drab worker, ready to take on. That could be a boiler suit. The man could be about to go in and clean a chemical tank. So, we can see, even in the way that soldiers are dressed and equipped, this profound change coming over. So, to sum up this part, it's a truly modern war, a mass industrial war. It uses the products, process and principles of mass industrial society. It's a war of systems and of systems of systems. I won't go into general systems theory, and ironically Jan Smuts, who was a General Jan Smuts was regarded as the father of modern systems theory, but one can actually do a study on this and look at the BEF and the process of battle in systems terms. It's a war of interdependency. You are no longer the lone gunner, or the lone rifleman. You are interdependent with others. It's a war of management now as well as command. Now, how had the BEF responded to this then? Well, we've already seen partially to some degree how they'd responded through the issue of the machine gun or machine. But the regular military did understand the importance and effectiveness of industry and technology now applied to battle. The development of what was known as the all-arms battle indicated that they understood the importance and effectiveness of integration of components in order to achieve efficiency. The all-arms battle, traditionally Britain fought with separate arms. The infantry attacked alone. If they required assistance from the engineers or the artillery, they requested it. The infantry, the artillery or the engineers arrived, fulfilled their task and then disappeared again. They fought in separate compartments in effect. Whereas now, in order to try and break through the line, all of these arms, artillery, infantry, engineers, Royal Flying Corps, have to be integrated with each other to create the all-arms battle. The notion being that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. they appointed Geddes, I've thrown this in really for Phil there, yeah, to Eric Geddes, the railway magnate, to completely reorganise their rear area services, the lines of communication, right the way from port to what was known as the railhead, which is where the war begins, as it were. And Geddes comes in and he throws every military shibboleth out of the window, and he completely revamps the system according to specifically civilian ideals and ideas. To him, shifting a division of soldiers, 20,000 men or thereabouts, is no different to shifting holidaymakers to Blackpool on a bank holiday. It's as simple as that. The movement of shells and guns is no different from the efficient movement of any other particular product. And even though it put noses out of joints, the Royal Engineers in particular were up in arms like this. They were losing a good deal of their power and control. Geddes backed and supported, Hay backed and supported Geddes, and Geddes came in and transformed the system. The expansion also of the support arms, traditionally ignored by the seniors, demonstrates at least some awareness on the part of the BEF of the role of support in all of this. But they failed to understand the logistical and engineering imperatives that underpinned mass industrial technological operations. To put it very simply, the machine gun, as a machine, can distribute 500 rounds per minute. It's a lot quicker than a rifle can. However, that means it consumes 500 rounds a minute, and you have to have a system which can supply it with 500 rounds a minute, which is far more than was ever supplied before. It is a hungry machine, and it requires its support. Now, when I talked about logistics and engineering, I thought it's about engineering this, isn't it, rather than logistics. Why do you keep bringing logistics in here? The two are inseparable. To put it very basically, in order for a lorry to go down a road has to be built in the first place. That's putting it extremely crudely. But the interlinkage between the two is so close that you can't really remove one from the other. Give you an idea of some of the expansion. Sappers and Drivers. 1914, the Army Service Corps, the drivers if we like, amounted to 14,491 troops. By 1918, it was 326,000, a colossal expansion. Royal Engineers, 24,014, 357,000 by 1918. And railway construction, 1914, was 1 mile. Whereas, railway construction, this is brand new track by the way, not repairs, 1,298 miles, which is something the British Rail really ought to take note of. I'm going to ask two important questions, which again go to the heart of the matter. Try and change perspectives. What is a soldier? You're asking, is this man an idiot? Bloke with a gun, isn't he? What were the trenches? Well, you go in there, the muddy, you don't get shot at, Rob. Come on, wake up. Well, I disagree with that. Because that's a martial perspective. And I do not believe that the martial perspective holds true. The question is, was he a warrior or was he a worker? Soldiers do not fight in modern World War. They certainly didn't fight in the Western Front in World War I. They might be in inaction, whatever that means, either under fire or actively engaged in operations for maybe 10 to 15 days every year. Question is what they're doing the rest of the time then. Well, I'll tell you, working party required. They will be digging, they will be wiring, they will be loading, they will be unloading, they will be shoveling stone, they will be required to go and work here for them, they will be required to unload trains, they'll be required to go and retrieve push trucks. They will be effectively a labourer. That is their actual job, the thing that they do most of the time. And this classic case there, men there, we're not pioneers, they're from the, I think it's the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Skin and Fusiliers, and they are using wheelbarrows. And this means that the life they're leading is not dissimilar from life in Blighty. It is a life where they will be labouring mostly, and indeed the bulk of the army on the Western Front for the British was urban working class, semi-skilled or unskilled, and they will be living in a city, they'll be living in uncomfortable circumstances, not madly dissimilar from crowded slums, so on and so forth. So it's not a million miles away from life in Blighty, and that's because, if you like, life in Blighty has been imported into Britain, into the Western Front. Soldiers even began to refer to going to work rather than attending a particular military function. They talked about knocked off at 4 p.m, got back to billet, absolutely shattered. That's my dad coming home. That's everybody's mother or father coming home. That's the way you feel after the end of the day. This is not the world of the soldier. And indeed officers themselves found themselves taking on the role of supervisor or manager, mostly supervisor. They became the foreman of works rather than a classic British infantry officer. Now this would have serious consequences for training, and in this new modern war, training your troops is everything. It matters a great deal. And as R.G. Bultitude wrote, the infantryman is a soldier by day and a navvy by night. Blunden perhaps put it better when he said, meanwhile days came and went, and every available man was holding the trenches or working in them or combining the warrior and the workman. Beautiful phrase. Again, if you thought that the Western Front was trenches, and that trenches are channels dug in the ground from which you can have a defensive point, well, that's not true, because that may have been how it was in the first place. Indeed, in 1914 we have rifle pits which become connected up because it's easier to do it that way, which then begin to coalesce and become more and more complex. Even if we look at the names given to the trenches themselves, the military mind would say Trench 127 or Trench 358, but they're not. Piccadilly Circus, Lancashire Walk, Warrington Way. They are reflections of urban, municipal and regional working class life. So the trench cities that grew up, the great metropolis, had the same functions and requirements as any modern metropolis. There were places of work, there were industrial areas, there were its slums and its suburbs, it had its streets, alleyways, roads and boulevards. It even had the posh house on the hill where the rich people lived, in this case aka Haig or your corps commander or divisional commander. It had signals, it had entertainment, it had washing facilities, bathing facilities. It was in every single respect a city. It even had its own municipal officers, designed called area commandants, who looked after the area. It had its bin men and its refuse workers. Every single function that you find in a city is replicated here. So the battlefield itself becomes a construction site because of the immense amount of work and development that goes on. And it's in a constant state of construction and repair as well. It's fundamentally a civilian war. And as it was put, the British Army in France was really a nation in concentrated extract. And here we have a picture there, which could be a scene, if you like, from just about any crowded road today. This one is a picture of the Leeds Inner Ring Road, taken this morning, 9 o'clock. Well, I think it makes the point. In there, this is not a martial scene. This is not a martial image, but it's one of the most familiar images of the Western Front in practice. And it's congestion on a road and the problems that it causes. Give you some idea of what the civilian ethos meant. It meant that if you were a Canadian, if you were a division and you had horses, and indeed the BAF was primarily horsed, then these are the materials you require for your horses. You know, this is Marshall. You'll need 12,000 tons of hardcore, 1.5 tons of nails, 3.5 miles of fascines, 18,000 sheets of iron, 3,960 wooden poles, and you'll need 60 trains to bring it all in. There were 60 divisions on the Western Front and they were constantly moving. So this becomes warfare. The provision of those sheets of iron, the tons of hardcore, and the men and the labour required to do this becomes the norm on the Western Front. So the context of the Western Front I'll give to Cyril Falls, writing the British Official History, 1917, Volume 2. Probably few commanders or staff officers realised to how large an extent the success of every operation on the Western Front depending on engineering, how much the campaign was, in the popular phrase, an engineer's war. So it's a profound shift. We now move on to Flanders. Flanders, especially the Battle of Third Ypres, known as Passchendaele. The military historian in me wants to point out that, so it's only 2 battles out of about 9 battles, is left an indelible mark on the British psyche. Its conditions, its reason why it was fought, what the men went through, plus the iconography of sacrifice. Even the name itself, Passchendaele, means the Vale of the Passion. In fact, in a recent Canadian film on Passchendaele, the hero in question, the innocent hero in question, who's caught up in the jaws of war, ends up at Passchendaele being crucified in a bizarre way, involving a shell blast which throws him through the air, and also some wood at the same time with some barbed wire, so he ends up hanging like this. What filmmakers would do to get the image. What we have here are some soldiers. You know what these soldiers are doing? They're Australians. I forget which battalion. They're commuting. They're commuting to the line in order to work. That's precisely what they're doing. The soldier may well have marched into battle in 14 and 15, but by 1917 he was commuting to work by bus or by rail or by Shank's pony. There is a profound difference. The Flanders Plan. It was an ambitious and major strategic action to clear Flanders, secure the channel and possibly form a flank. This great thing they're after. Note, to secure the channel, you need to secure the channel for Britain's security and also to secure the ports upon which everything depends, because that's where all the material's coming through. This would not necessarily have been the case 50 years earlier. The plan itself had been in gestation since 1915. It's planned for 16, but that was sidelined by the Somme. It's planned for 1917, but this was replaced by the Nivelle offensive, a French general who promised he could break through the line in 48 hours using, well, a system not unlike that of Guerre Outrance and the Will. It failed disastrously. In late April 1917, the go-ahead was given, which was somewhat late in the year for it to be done. To give you an idea about what it is, I haven't got a laser pointer here, I'll skip through this quite quickly. Stage 1 was an attack at a place called Messines, which on here is just at the bottom there. Messines is a 60-metre hill feature which overlooked the battlefield, so this was necessary to take this out first in order to secure the battlefield that was just to come. Stage 2, they would capture the Passchendaele-Staden Ridge. From thence, they could then move out of the trenches entirely and cut the railways of the Germans. Two rail lines that run very, very close together. Note, the objective is not to destroy the German army, but to cut the railway lines. Because without railway lines, the Germans cannot supply their northern troops and will have to withdraw from Flanders with all the strategic implications that carries. Stage 4, breakout. Combined land and amphibious operations spreading everywhere. The yellow arrows will tell you where they're going. To Ostend, Bruges, Zeebrugge and Kortrijk. And thus the war will end. And there was every reason to believe that this was the case, because in material terms, manpower terms, the BEF was now way stronger than it ever was, whilst Germany is on the decline. Now the first attack was Messines, and the idea was to fight a limited depth bite and hold artillery-centred operation, which is based directly on the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which had occurred in April earlier that year. Now, limited depth bite and hold artillery-centred, one of the things they'd learned, especially from the Somme in 1915, is that if you do actually manage to break through the defences or into defences, this is what happens. Your troops will rapidly outrun their artillery, upon which they are dependent. They will outrun their supply lines. They will become disorganised and take increasing casualties. The enemy will counterattack, and you will be pushed back to roughly where you were in the same place at very high cost. How to beat this conundrum? Well, with a bite and hold approach, it's the artillery defined how far you could go. Again, the machine now begins to dominate the objective, and the practices of the machine dominate the practices of battle. By doing so, this meant the artillery, vastly expanded, could produce walls of shells in front of your own infantry to protect them. It's like a curtain of fire protecting them, with multiple curtains of fire, integrated machine gun fire. And that meant that when the enemy counterattacked, they would have to go through these walls of fire, and inevitably their counterattacks would be broken up, which meant that you took the ground and, importantly, you kept it. The assault depth at Messines was about 3,000 yards. That's the rough rule of thumb. It's between 2,000 and 3,000 yards is the distance your artillery can fire effectively to provide you with protection. The famous mines at Messines obliterated the first line, and there was artillery protection for troops right up to their final objective. It's interesting to note that the curtains of fire extended further than the actual battlefield itself. That 3,000 yards extended out to 5,000 yards in front. And it relied on a colossal amount of shells. For Messines, the bulk allotment of shells, for ammunition, just shells alone, was 144,000 tonnes. A colossal amount. There it is, the Royal Marine Artillery guarantee for peace. What was the artillery preparation like? Well, it was a colossal bombardment. It lasted 11 days. There were 2,266 artillery pieces, which is an enormous amount of artillery. It meant there was one gun for every 7.5 yards of assault. And noticeably, they've got a lot of heavy guns as well. Heavy guns are the most important guns. It's been found that, if you like, the lightweight field artillery itself, based upon the idea of this moral gunner, this warrior gunner, has given way to industrial reality that big is most definitely better here. 144,000 tons of ammunition were dumped, which equates to 1 ton for every second, fired on a land feature which I can walk in 25 minutes. And you could as well, very, very easily. It was an enormous weight of firepower. Indeed, you can actually do calculations, others have done it, which show that it's the equivalent of, I think it's 14 W-47 nuclear, tactical nuclear bombs. So we're looking at an enormous nuclear level here of firepower that you can measure in megatons. It was a big success. It worked, unsurprisingly. It had 2 years of preparation, roads, railway, and thousands of tons of, well, everything. Shells, 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition for machine gun barrages. It increased the amount of motor transport they had, lorries from 4,400 to 7,500. Tents, shelters, and 200,000 beach slabs used for the forward roads, which would be, of course, annihilated by this barrage. The barrage itself cost 17 million quid. I went into the Financial Times historical calculator to see what it was at 2010 prices, and this barrage, for an assault which lasted, well, technically it lasted, I think it was 7 or 8 days. In practice, the battle was more or less over within about 3 days. 1,163,480,000 pounds. That today would bankrupt the entire country if we tried to do that. It is a colossal investment, and that is just for the barrage, let alone everything else. So the return, in terms of achieving the end of the war, getting near of some kind of decision, on the level of material investment was very small, because they advanced 3,000 yards and then they stopped, because that's as far as they could go. Can the BEF afford such outlay for so little return? This is also, if we like, the logic of industrialised war. Third Ypres itself, controversial. Within military circles, one of the controversies is the appointment of General Hubert Poer de la Gough, brother of Johnny Gough VC. He was allegedly chosen for this campaign because he was a thrusting cavalryman. The other contender was a chap called Herbert Onslow Plumer, who was the basis of David Lowe's cartoon of Colonel Blimp. If you like, Plumer was a plodding infantryman. He did things slowly and he did things carefully. Initially, he was the guy who fought Messines in charge of the Second Army. He wanted to go forward 1,200 yards. British High Command and Haig said, no, not for that kind of outlay. We want some more return on that. It didn't even include the villages of Messines and Vichgart in his first day assault in his original planning, but he's kind of forced to go further. Now, many have argued that Plumer should have been chosen to conduct the main offensive at 3rd Ypres, the big one. And the argument runs that actually, no, he's not chosen because he's too much of a plodder and we're looking for a breakthrough of some sort, some kind of decision here. Hence, Gough is chosen. And he has sought a breakthrough, a depth of assault, 5,000 yards in a single bound. This is not quite breakthrough operations, but it's getting there. One of the other reasons of the controversy with the appointment of Gough is there was a 7-week gap between Messines itself, which took place in June, and 3rd Ypres, which began on the 31st of July. And the argument was it's because Gough had to familiarise himself with the ground. Yeah, as a new thrusting cavalryman, which is greater weight to the why didn't they use Plumer argument. Well, it's all tosh. It's just unsustainable rubbish. I'm going to task the official history on this one and say no. Preparatory conditions are far from ideal. The cost of victory at Messines is part of the problem. It used up so many resources of the BEF that when you tried to move it a mere 7 miles further north, you hit the Rubik's Cube problem, which is, has anybody ever decorated a small room where they can't get anything out? If you have, you'll find yourself shuffling things around, like some of those old sort of puzzles where you have to move the square around, yeah? And it takes forever to actually go and paint the room. You find you've moved the room around. And they're in the same problem here. It's far more difficult to get across town than it is necessarily to drive down a motorway. They've got so few roads in the area, so few rail, and such a colossal amount of material coming through it that it takes about 7 weeks to move everything to its new point, get it bedded in, get it connected up with the system, ready to start firing. So again, we see, interestingly, that the official historian sees this in martial terms, a thrusting cavalryman versus a plodding infantryman. However, the reality is much more prosaic, much more civilian. It's about transportation and congestion. That's really all it's about. He also the weapons that he got, the vehicles that he got, were subject to an awful lot of wear and tear. BEF had correctly grasped the importance of these. What they had not grasped fully was that you need to constantly maintain and repair these things as well. Engineering considerations. You also have bad weather. Now, one of the problems of the First World War when you attack is you don't have any way of inculcating surprise. Surprise is everything. But of course, you can't go left, you can't go right, you certainly can't hide behind a hill, not at Ypres, you're fully exposed. Yeah? And so, you don't even try and inculcate surprise. Yeah? This will be a battle of annihilation. So what happened? Well, he attacked at Pilcombe Ridge on the 31st of July, initial results are good, and then it begins to read pretty much like any battle from early 1916. The infantry overreached themselves, the guns can't be moved forward, the whole thing's compounded by heavy rain, protected barrages aren't working, the German guns at a place called Glamour, which is over to the right, are not suppressed, and the battle bogs down. Tries again, middle of August 1917, captures Langemarck, but not a success for pretty much the same reasons. And so Gough is replaced. A failure of Gough to achieve any concrete results, the heavy casualties, the increasing discontent as well of the BEF. For the first time they're beginning to get worried about their morale. They needn't have been, but they began to worry. On the 25th of August 1917, Plumer's Second Army takes over the primary role. Mary's Plumer, David Lowe's cartoon, a genuine Colonel Blimp, except that actually he's quite a clever and advanced general. Now, they needed to deal with the guns, the artillery on the right flank at Gellerville. Therefore, he shifted his operations. Instead of going where the dotted line is, straight for the goal, Passchendaele, he deals with the guns on the right. He realises that artillery is the central fact. So he concentrates his assault on the southern portion, a sector. And instead of going for this great breakthrough, he proposes a series of limited operations of the type I've discussed before, but in sequence. So they can inevitably gobble up these yards. You then move the guns forward. You do it again, repeat, move the guns forward, do it again, repeat. The idea will be you either attrit the Germans, horrible American word attrit, but it's actually quite useful, or the Germans will eventually break, or you will achieve a breakthrough cumulatively. The first assault was at Menin Road on 20th of September, and he was given a full 3 weeks to prepare. He also had fine weather conditions for observation and for the movement of guns and ammunition. If you all think that 3rd Ypres and Passchendaele is about 30 feet of mud permanently everywhere, it's not. Well, the biggest problem they had in the preparation for this offensive was dust, and the fact that and springs breaking because of the hardness of the road. That was one of the big problems they had. So, sequential bite and hold ups. Just to recap, used by Plumer in the autumn of 17. Once you've got your ground and consolidate, artillery move forward, process is repeated. The critical element, of course, is moving the artillery forward. Artillery moves by the leave of the ground. And bite and hold operations require a colossal supply capability. They're based upon tonnages of shells. Messines was a bite and hold operation, 144,000 tons. And the movement of ammunition, artillery, men and engineering materials, just to name a few, requires good roads, railways and tracks. But all these are destroyed by the very system that you're using. 144,000 tons of ammunition has to go somewhere, and it goes in front of you, just where you're going to move forward to. So these are all destroyed, and they need rebuilding. So logistics and engineering demands increase dramatically as the depth of the advance increases. And this creates also vast infantry manpower demands, because, weirdly enough, even though they'd expanded the engineers, the bulk of that expansion had taken place with specialisation and in the lines of communication on the rear. At the front, the domain of the traditional Royal Engineers, each division has 3 field companies. Now, if you don't know what that means, it's quite simple. That amounts to around about 750 men in a division which consists of about 18,000 men. Now, originally in 1915 it was 2, but they've increased that to 3. That's a whole 33% increase. The numbers there are absolutely laughable, risible, because generally speaking a field company needed anything up to around about 1,000 men to support them and do the labouring for them. So if the movement of guns defines the pace of the advance and the rate of what's known as operational tempo, that each attack has to take place rapidly in order to keep the enemy off guard, and the movement of guns is hostage to the rate of construction, And the construction rate was defined by engineering and logistic factors. Now, any factory owner, any of the great moguls back in Britain could have told them that. If you have a factory, unless you have the logistics connections to them, the roads and communications, the railways, the marshalling yards, your factory isn't going to move anything. It's vital. It's what made the Industrial Revolution happen in the first place. Canals, roads, rail. The cumulative strain, which is increasing, decreases the rate of the operations. So your operations are always going to fail. It's an unrecognised operational problem since 1915. They've grasped the technology. They've grasped other elements. But what they've not grasped is what underpins all of it in the first place. And the failure to understand this led to operational disaster at the Battle of Polkapelle on the 9th of October 1917, after 3 previous offensives, which were celebrated throughout the British press. I don't think there was any ringing out of bells, but we're not far off. Indeed, the last one of these before the disaster occurs, nets a bag of something like 5,000 German prisoners. And the Germans themselves declare it as a black day of the German army. It's so bad. And it's on that day, Crown Prince Ruprecht of the German forces in Flanders begins to consider a withdrawal. But it has the seeds of its own failure deep within it. And even though, like a pothole, they could not see what was happening, it would happen. Eventually, that pothole, which you don't see, which is boring away underneath, the top will fall in all of a sudden. And that's precisely what happens with these operations. Give you an idea of what colossal firepower means and destruction means. I have 3 photographs of Tyne Cot area taken the 16th of June 1917, the first one. Your little blue arrow is to help you orientate yourself. You have just a curve there, and Tyne Cot Cemetery is where those trenches are just there. That's a railway line. There's a railway line there, and that's the road up to Passchendaele. And you can see on the 16th of June 1917, you've got shapes of fields, more or less. You can still see trees on the road to Passchendaele itself. It's not madly dissimilar from what it was in pre-war times. So that's what it was on the 16th of June. Let's move forward. This is what it was like on the 2nd of October as the British artillery began to get nearer and nearer and nearer. There's the corner of the railway. There's the road down to Passchendaele. No trees. And this here is the curve of the road with Tyne Cot. And as you can see, it's a bit of a moonscape there. It's been pretty much battered and destroyed, though you can just about make out some roads there. Between the 2nd of October and the 10th of October, this is what they did. I think the photograph speaks absolutely eloquently. Blue line should orientate, arrow should orientate yourself. Corner of the railway, there's the road just round there, and this is Tyne Cot. Now, wasn't the rain that did that? It wasn't visited by God. It was a range of artillery, predominantly British artillery, that did that, as part of this firepower-based system, itself based upon productivity. It's an industrialisation and all the ethos that goes with it. The BEF, its commanders, whilst grasping this, failed to fully understand the implications. This notion of logistics and engineering. Now, moving on, the world of the working party, which is what sustained all of this, was pretty much ignored in favour of the battle. A battle only takes up a fraction of the soldier's time. Most of the time is a soldier of labour. What was it like preparing for Passchendaele? I'm going to give you a private Longstaff. It's more the lingua franca that matters here. 21st of October, up at 2:30 a.m, very dark. Breakfast. Started at 3:15. Long walk past transports and ammunition column. Arrive at dump at 4:30. Work on Plank Road. He's a infantryman, by the way. Huge guns all round. Mud awful. Dead men and horses all round. Thousands of men working. Rush job on road through swamp. Ammunition, mules and horses passing continuous stream. Fritz shelling both sides of the road. There is a martial context there, but it's the discussion of transport, ammunition column, work on roads. That's the matter. This is his experience of Passchendaele. Has nothing to do with, oh Jesus, make it stop, to quote a certain poet. It's really about going to work in some fairly awful circumstances. Same thing again, yeah. Rectanks and pillboxes. Worked on road, sandbags and carrying planks, up to our knees in mud. Quit at 11 a.m. Quit? You quit work. You know, quit your position in battle. So the importance of Passchendaele in terms of engineering was that more or less the same operational system which was developed at Vimy Ridge in April and honed at Hill 70 in August was used at Passchendaele. This idea of this bite. And the importance of Passchendaele is in engineering terms. how to cross this devastated ground. How do we do it? Well, there was a thing called the Lindsay Report, which I'll go into in a little while, which was done by a Canadian chief engineer named of W.B. Lindsay. And Currie accepted this report. And this report is very different from anything that the British were producing. Effectively, it envisaged a colossal expansion of engineers in the Canadian forces, the Canadian Corps, way beyond anything that the British had ever even begun to think of. And Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps, really puts himself very much in the camp of the civilian rather than the marshal, because he makes the ultimate sacrifice, if you like. No commander is generally willing to do this. He will cut infantry in favour of engineers if necessary. Now this is very symbolic, if you like, of the most profound change in cultural shift. Now Lindsay wasn't a civil engineer, he was a regular soldier, he was an engineer. He was taught at Royal Academy Kingston in Ontario, which itself stressed on producing officers who would be useful for the civil development of Canada, hydrology, engineering, bridges, so on and so forth. And in 1918, the Canadians did expand their engineering complement. Instead of having 3 field companies in a division, it's about 170, it's about 400 men in all, plus 1,000 pioneers, 800, about 12 to 1,400 men. He expanded it so that you had over 3,000 men in each division in the form of a brigade. Effectively, since they had 4 divisions, the Canadians had created a supersized engineering division, the likes of which the British never seen before. And in 1918, it's interesting to note that the Canadians are extraordinarily successful in what they do. And Currie argued it's because we had the engineers and labour to do the job, which left the infantry free to train and concentrate on battle itself. Again, the report, which has got the most boring title in the world, Methods of Ammunition Distribution Used in Recent Operations, November 9th, 1917. He argued that current operational engineer resources were absolutely inadequate. There was a chronic lack of manpower and incoherent structure. The working party system seriously interferes with infantry training, and it also leads to poor quality work. Troops are not, generally speaking, labourers. They don't want to labour. Their officers certainly don't want to labour. They need rest, they need training, they are totally reluctant. And just when you've got them trained up to get doing the job, so they're digging faster than they were before, more effective, more efficiently, the British Army system means that they will be relieved and you'll have to, another working party will come in, you have to do the same thing all over again. As I said, this enormous expansion of engineer resources, which I've already done. The other thing is, it was controlled at corps level. Now, corps is the operational level. Divisions didn't have these. Brigades didn't have these. It was gathered at the highest level, commensurate with the width of the operation, which is just the same as any commercial enterprise would do as well. And by doing so, he creates this engineering division, whereby the entire division, if necessary, can be applied to just a single task, or it can be broken up and spread amongst the other units themselves. Weirdly enough, in 1922, the Royal Engineer Report came to the same conclusion, that these numbers are the kind of numbers that was needed, but that was buried afterwards. It's even still a problem today. 2006, a report in the US Army that each division has nowhere enough engineers and engineering labour, and that therefore they should expand them to a figure which is pretty much the same as what Lindsay came up with. On top of that, so there were other reports as well, one done by H.O. Clogston, the 3rd Australian Division. He was the Commander Royal Engineer there. He doesn't actually have any command power, he has to do what his commanding officer says. He's commander in name only, otherwise he's advisory. And he came to pretty much the same conclusion and suggested the same thing. Unfortunately, the Australian Corps did not have as much political and military clout as the Canadian Corps did, and therefore they were refused, whereas the British could not stop the Canadians from doing their thing. So I've discussed this hidden manpower problem, that most of the time the soldier wields a spade and not a rifle, and that the material nature of the war requires increasing amount of combat labour. The BF have become absolutely dependent on infantry as a source of very inefficient labour. John Monash, writing in October in 1917, the celebrated commander of the Australian Corps, noted that of the 3 brigades of his infantry, he only ever had 2, because one, that's over 3,000 men, were constantly required for corps fatigues, the building of roads. On top of that, he also had to find men to labour on the division's own needs as well. So in practice, he probably had about 50% of the available troops that he required. They did increase the labour corps. They brought in a vast and massive labour corps, bringing contract workers from China, Vietnam, all around the world. Problem is that these were not soldiers. Generally speaking, they worked in the rear areas. They also released a lot of known as PB men, or permanent base men who had been injured or a bit too old, or a bit too fat, or a touch of the gout or something like that, to go and work as in the labour corps. And stop and think about that. Generally speaking, labouring is a young man's job. You've got to be fairly fit. I did a bit of labouring in my early years. You've got to heft bricks around, so on and so forth. And the problem is that we've got innumerable amount of labour in the rear area. The rear area is not a problem. It's the front that matters. That's where you need the labour, where the shells are dropping. And the labour corps won't go there. They're not trained to go there. Certainly the Chinese are not contracted to go there in the first place. So the attempt to try and boost the labour backfired because they did not understand the nature of the problem and the task. Manpower crisis, well, what were the consequences? To compound things even further, in November of 1917, Lloyd George announced that he's going to cut the infantry by 25%. That means you just lost 25% of your labour. And he proposes using extra firepower to take that into account, if you like to rebalance it. Well, extra firepower creates what's known as a T3R problem. That means tooth to combat, a tooth to tail ratio, the number of men required to support an infantryman in his task. The more you mechanise, the more you bring in these industrial principles, the more firepower you bring in, the more of the support that you need. So there is no increase in support. There's a 25% cut in combat labour in effect. Spiraling labour demands already seriously interfering with vital training. This cut will compound it. So in 1918, when the BEF, exhausted, moves on to defence, it will not have enough troops to either man or even build their new defence system. The consequences of which, the famous retreat of the 5th Army in March and the penetration of the Germans up to a depth of 40 miles is well known. All a direct consequence of not grasping the parameters of a modern industrial war. I've already done with Lindsay there, so I'm going to move on past that as well. So have a look at some reflections. That was a rather poignant figure. The Canadian wandering across the battlefield near a place called Zonnebeck. And again, I'll just pop back if I can, machine. Even though we blame the mud and the weather for this, it is not the mud and the weather that has done this damage. The mud and weather created those shell holes. It was our own artillery. And again, I ask you, how are you meant to get, say, something like a 9.2-inch howitzer, which weighs in at some 27 tons in all, has to be dragged by a caterpillar tractor on tracks, and is over 80 feet long in its whole thing. You fancy trying to drive over that with that? No, you will need to build proper roads, an engineering concern. So, the success of Vimy, Messines and Plumer's Ypres operation is contrasted with the failure of Gough's operations. The reality is actually much more ambiguous though. There was success at Arras, which was in early 1917, which was a breakthrough operation in effect. And Cambrai, which bookends the other end of the war, was also a deep penetration. But the problem is one, with whatever system you use, of a failure to exploit this. Problem is how do you exploit this if you don't have the engineering and therefore the logistic capacity to do so? And it's interesting to note that just like the Ypres operations, which bogged down eventually because they could not get the guns forward, the supplies forward, or the ammunition forward, exactly the same problem occurred at Arras. They broke through 3.5 miles on the first day, then had to stop at the end of the second day because it outranged everything and they had no guns forward because they didn't have roads. The Vimy Ridge, which was a success in 12 hours. It was on April the 9th, they were still building the roads for the heavy artillery across there in the back end of June. It's also tremendously expensive as well, in terms of manpower, in terms of material, in terms of sheer cost. And it's more than the BEF can afford. We do not have a bottomless purse, and we are beginning to suffer various shortages and skills and various other shipping crises and so on and so forth back in UK at this time. So we've reached our apogee and we've gone over it. So we have not utilised our materials to their best effect because of this engineering issue. The sequential limited offensive, so lauded by many military historians, and they are actually architects of their own failure. Even though the imagery of Passchendaele is associated with Haig, the man most responsible for it is every military historian's favourite general of the First World War, which was Plumer. And it's interesting to note that eventually it will be deep penetration rather than this careful step-by-step approach which costs so much, which will be the hallmark of later 1918 operations. Britain was therefore fighting a material Schlacht, a material war, whether it realised it or not. Mass industrial warfare requires not just artillery, but the means and methods to move, maintain and supply it and everything else. This was recognised in terms of the lines of communication supplied through the Geddes reforms in 1916, but it also applies to operational development, planning, method and execution. But the failure of the BEF to fully recognise this equated to the failure of operations in 1917, which equated to a war which has left an indelible scar upon the psyche of the British in particular since 1918. Last words, concluding points. Major flaw in BF operation development, failure to fully recognise their dominant role. 1915, they nearly had it, they were close. GHQ memo stresses that the twin pillars of operations should be artillery and engineering. But the retention of at least a partial Marshall view of combat means that they saw the importance of the guns, they developed the artillery dramatically, they gave it the proper command and control, but they did not do so with engineering. In fact, it was just given lip service, reflecting the perceptual and conceptual limits imposed by the military ethos and culture. A chap called P.G. Grant, Chief Engineer, 5th Army, noted that all commanders were aware of the primacy of road construction in the forward area in order to move the artillery forward and the shells forward in order to repeat the process, but they simply pay it lip service. This is because it had reached their perceptual and conceptual limits. They could not see beyond the gun itself. So the BF recognise the central role played by artillery, but do not fully grasp the fact that artillery relies on engineering and logistics to move and supply them just like industrial society does. So the lack of proper engineering organisation, and I've not really talked about this today, but a proper command and control system. They were effectively advisory, so if their loony commander turned around and said, I don't care about roads, there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. And the lack of trained labour is the reason for operational failure in 1917, despite all those Allied advantages and despite the preceding 3 years of war which had brought them to a point where they had those advantages. And that concludes my talk for today. Thank you.